Hello and welcome to another YouTube video. Today we're going to talk about lats, specifically the lat prayer motion, why it's not a great motion for lats, and what you should do instead. So first things first, just briefly some lat anatomy. I have a string of fibers here that I'm going to kind of use to demo, and I'll put a scapula and a humerus on here in a second. I tried to do stuff with the fixed portion of it over here, but it just ended up being a total disaster, so please forgive me as I try to demo all this stuff. Again, 3 lat divisions. First is going to be the thoracic region, which runs basically from all these different thoracic vertebrae on the lower portions of the rib cage up into the upper arm. Again, picture the arm over here. They all attach to that same point, basically on the inner portion of the humerus. So if I could take the arm here, they basically are going to all attach somewhere around there if this arm is facing that way. Okay, very important. Number one. Number two. From the thoracic region, again, from here to about here. From the lumbar region, that second division, which is going to be oriented a little bit more vertically, and then the most vertical ones are going to attach somewhere down to the hip, the iliac crest, and they're going to run up to that same point on the upper arm. So when we say, okay, lats, this is a good lat exercise, kind of a difficult thing to wrap the head around there because, you know, all of the different divisions behave so differently, right? All of them, technically, yeah, we call them lats, but one of them, the ones that run most horizontal, not so coincidentally, pull the arm very horizontally. The ones that run more vertical, pull the arm from high to low more vertically, right? So when we say lats, we're really talking about a specific division of the lats and not really the total lat. Of course, there are exercises that you can do that are more biased toward the total lat, which we'll get to in a second. But when we talk about a lat prayer, that's going to be like more of a vertically loaded motion. So if any of the lats are going to be really, really involved in that motion, it's going to be the lower or the iliac lats, which again are the ones that attach down from the hip and sort of wrap up and into the upper arm, if you can picture it over here, across the rib cage. So all 3 lats will run across the ribs to some degree, right? So if they're the thoracic lats picture, I'll just put this bundle down for a sec. The thoracic fibers are going to sort of wrap around this way, right? Sort of actually in and slightly upward, if you can imagine that toward the arm. The lower ones are going to run more obliquely on the rib cage, and then the most low are going to run most vertically, but they're still all going to utilize the rib cage as what we would call an anatomical pulley, which is basically just a fancy way to say if the arm is tighter to the body and I'm doing a pull down or a row, the lats will gain leverage to move the arm in those positions as opposed to the wider positions or the completely overhead position. So when we talk about a lat prayer, we're talking about a position basically where, you know, the scapula is going to be in this upwardly rotated position to support the upper arm here in this overhead location. Okay, so what is the issue with this overhead location? And if you know a little bit about anatomy, you can kind of maybe see this coming, where if I have my arm totally overhead and I'm doing that sort of lat prayer type motion where I'm pulling down with my palms, you know, facing the ground the entire time, what's going to happen is, if you can picture all these lats sort of coming in onto the humerus here, again, imagine a scapula here, right? All of those lats, even the most vertical ones, which are going to be the ones that have the most advantage, right? Because if you were to picture the thoracic ones, like the load is basically pulling the arm this way, and there's literally no possible way that these guys could contribute to moving the arm this way, right? So the most vertical fibers are basically just going to be running directly through the arm. So if you can imagine like this sort of line of pull in this position, the most vertical fibers, which again are going to be the ones that would be contributing to this motion, are the ones that would basically just be pulling the arm this way and not, go to this other side, contributing to any of the motion. I'll just remove the fibers for a sec, motion this way. Okay, so you have a motion in the lat prayer that is basically loading the arm again in that top position this direction. Okay, so you need a muscle that is able to pull the arm, at least in that top position, forward from there, okay? Especially this top sort of portion of the arc, it's going to be mostly like a horizontal, I'm pushing the arm forward away from the load type motion. Rear delt, teres, because they do attach directly to the scapula and because the scapula can upwardly rotate, have a little bit of a line of pull to actually do that sort of forward motion in addition to the long head of the triceps, right? But the lat doesn't really have any leverage to actually move the arm down into extension from that overhead position. And that's, keep in mind, what people are saying, oh, the lats get the greatest stretch, right? Most of the people feel really sore when they do this lat prayer exercise. Again, picture this position. They feel sore really right here. So they think, oh, the lat insertion runs somewhere up in here. I'm really sore in my lats, but the whole body of the lats spans all the way down across the ribs and to the lower portions of the spine and the hip, as we already mentioned, okay? So because the lats don't have leverage in this position, or really the leverage they do have is just to basically centrate and pull the arm directly downward, the rear delts, the teres, the long head of the triceps are going to be the things that actually initiate that motion out of the top of the lat prayer. Now you might be asking, okay, maybe they don't have a ton of leverage there, but they pick up leverage at a little bit lower point in flexion, right? So what I would say is, yeah, totally agree, right? Because if you picture the arm, right, maybe at this degree of flexion, which would be sort of mimicking this pull down type position, the lats, especially closer to the body, oops, dropped my fiber there. The lats, when the arm is closer to the body and sort of up in that flex position, have a degree of pull. Hopefully I'm illustrating this okay to sort of get the point across, right? They're going to wrap in and up to the arm here, right? And the lowermost ones are going to have a really good distance here to basically pull the arm downward, especially if I pull the arm sort of upward and across, where these other tissues would actually lose leverage and where the lats would gain leverage. So anytime that I'm basically bringing my arm across my body this way, right, which would be sort of this equivalent or this equivalent, the lats not only are going to get more stretch because they're stretching around this sort of conical shaped rib cage, but they're also going to have better leverage, okay? So when we look at the pullover, yeah, again, that top portion of the range, not really anything for the lats to do there other than to basically just act as kind of a stabilizer to hold the joint there. But as they start to get down into this lower degree of flexion, they're going to pick up their contribution, right? And so when people get into this position, which would be like sort of as they start to get down and the load is pulling more directly up, a good amount of lat involvement there, not as much as if you had your arm like more tucked to your body and actually your palms supinated so that your arm were tighter to your body. So if you're going to do like a lat prayer type motion, what I would recommend is doing it palm up to the ceiling as opposed to palm down. But that's a little bit tangential for this discussion. And then as they pull down more and more, they're going to have more and more leverage toward the bottom half of that motion. So that's typically where people will feel the good squeeze, and also where the load, okay, so now we're switching gears here. Picture that this is a cable load and now no longer a muscle fiber. When I'm in that bottom position, assuming I set the cable up like most people do, where they really hinge over and then the cable starts to go overhead, right? The cable will be pulling this way in this position, and as I come down, it's kind of, the cable is like almost acting in this direction, right? So there is now a force, again, if you picture the arm now coming down and toward the sides, right, in this position, the cable is kind of pulling at this angle, right? So now the lats have a really good degree of leverage to be able to actually pull the shoulder joint into that sort of depressed, more extended position, especially because of the lower angle of flexion or the lower angle of elevation that they're at, okay? So they do pick up leverage toward the bottom half of the motion, but now you have to keep in mind the fact that, like, okay, really only the lower portions of the lats are going to be able to create this sort of a downward force. To some degree, the middle lats will, but to basically no degree, the lower lats, or sorry, the most upper portions of the lats, they would want to pull the arm back and sort of behind the body as opposed to more down as that lower division would. So again, if anything, toward the second half of the range, the lower portions of the lats are going to be the ones that really aid in that sort of centration and sort of that downward type force. Again, toward the end of that motion, where it's the load is, again, that cable is pulling, this person's arm more up at that point, as opposed to, like, again, in that overhead position here, the cable would be acting directly that way. So the cable goes from acting that way to now acting more this way. The lats are going to contribute in that bottom portion. But if you were to just ask yourself, okay, where would the lats, number one, stretch more, have more leverage, more ability to act and load? They would have more of those abilities in any sort of actual pull down motion that's done, as I mentioned earlier, narrowed to the body. So pull downs, at sort of this angle, pull downs or rows more at this angle, but all really proportionately tight to the body. Again, where these fibers can stay nice and tight to the rib cage the entire time. Again, where they have leverage to move the arm back and also down over the other muscles that we mentioned before, okay? In addition, what I would recommend is any sort of pull down or row type motion that's, again, loaded across your body. So maybe you have a cable that's pulling you in that direction. and you're rowing sort of in this vector, or you have a cable that's pulling you up and across and you're loading yourself down and across, right? Those are going to be the most beneficial exercises from like a stretch perspective, because again, the lats will stretch more when the arm is across the body as opposed to directly upward. And I want to also make clear that like the overhead pull down or the overhead pull over the lat prayer, not a bad exercise. It's just most people, when they claim, you know, this is a great lat exercise, I think are really missing the mark on just the physics deal of it, or the physics portion of it, in addition to those other variables that I mentioned, like the alternate recruitment of rear delt, teres, long-headed triceps. So hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully that demonstration was like somewhat useful from a visual perspective. If it wasn't, please ask any sort of clarifying questions below, and I'll be happy to answer any of them. But sort of just to go over again and sort of summarize, if you know maybe we missed some points there. Lat prayer, again, done in this sort of a direction where I'm really hinged over and that load is pulling me up. In that top position, my arm will be in this upwardly rotated position where the load is pulling my arm backward. So I need something to pull my arm this direction, horizontally overhead, which again, none of the lats are going to do. They're only really going to pick up leverage toward this bottom half. So where you would want it to be loaded most in that stretch position is where it's loading other tissues. And then where you would want it to be loaded, you know, still most directly, obviously, if it's a lat specific exercise, but where you would want the loading to drop off, which to some degree it does, is where the lats start to pick up leverage toward that bottom of the range, where they can really act to sort of depress the scapula and the humerus as well as the clavicle all sort of together, where that loading is more sort of upward and away from the body as opposed to directly overhead. So again, hopefully that was useful, and please let me know what questions you have specifically in the comment section, and I will try to get to all of them.